I'm here today with Reverend Tyler Sitt. Tyler's just came out with a new book called Staying Awake, The Gospel for Changemakers. So Tyler is a pastor. He is a church planter. He planted a church called New City Church in metropolitan Minneapolis. It's a church that focuses on environmental justice. He's a lover of Minnesota, a United Methodist pastor, the son of a Chinese immigrant. He earned a BS in Communication Studies from Boston University and an MDiv from Candler School of Theology, and has lived in 4 continents. So I'd love to actually hear more about that, Tyler. He has formal training as a prison chaplain, community organizer, and social entrepreneur. And when he's not at New City, you'll find him wandering around the Mississippi River. His church has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Minnesota Public Radio, and more locations. So Tyler, it's really wonderful to have you join us here today.
Glad to be here.
So if I could, let me read a couple of blurbs, endorsements for the book. This one's by Barbara Brown Taylor. This book is so smart, so fresh, and so bursting with energy for spirit-led justice that it makes me want to do a do-over at being Christian. As the author says, it's not a self-help book, but a community help book, written as much for those who have lost faith in church as for those who are just discovering what it's really all about. If you too want to be part of God's sacred composting project, you will not find a better gardener for your soul than Tyler. So that's really a wonderful commentary by Barbara. And then let me read one from Brandon Robertson, another one of our Writing for Your Life friends. Staying Awake is a winsome and much-needed guide for anyone seeking to follow Jesus beyond the 4 walls of church. Drawing on his experience as a pastor and activist, Tyler practically presents disciplines that help to fan the flame of our faith and keep us engaged in the work of justice in sustainable and impactful ways. This is one of the most practical, thought-provoking, and frankly fun guides for living out the way of Jesus, that I've come across. Christians everywhere need to wrestle with the lessons of this important book. So Tyler, that's just really glowing statements about your book. Congratulations on that.
I really, really am humbled by those endorsements. And I think that the truth of the matter is that so much of Staying Awake came out of community conversations, practical conversations, applying to Christianity to real people's lives. And I think the endorsers kind of picked up on the scent of that, and that's kind of how we got to where we are.
Well, before we talk more about the book, tell us more about your background. How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so like you said in my intro, I'm the son of a Chinese immigrant and a white woman from Minnetonka, Minnesota. Okay. They met at a disco dancing class at the University of Minnesota.
Wow.
And so I just, as the child of an interracial couple, I just grew up always hearing the stories of hardship, of my parents having to prove their love to folks who didn't buy into interracial couples, but also stories of resilience. My parents told me, Tyler, sometimes society gets it wrong and God gives us love to fix it. And I think that that's kind of foundationally my orientation towards both theology and social change, is that society isn't a fixed thing. It's malleable, it's plastic. And the way that we shape it is with love. So that's how I grew up in little Minnesota. Okay. And then I went to Boston University for my undergrad, really, really benefited from the legacies of Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. there, and started a LGBTQ plus ministry. That's also, as far as continents go, I studied a semester in Ecuador and also Israel, Palestine.
Wow.
And then in seminary, I studied a semester in the Dalai Lama's Tibetan Buddhist community in Dharamsala, India.
Wow.
So yeah, I have a lot of passion for the world, and I just see God showing up in all of these places. So it just became natural to me that I would lead people in experiences of the divine, like facilitate those encounters. And so I became a pastor. And then as I looked back on my trail, like I was always starting things. I was always convening things. I was always gathering people. So a good mentor of mine spoke church planting in my life, and then we started New City Church.
Yeah, yeah. So you've also done chaplaincy work too.
Yes.
Prison
So
chaplaincy, right?
yes. So during seminary, I was a prison chaplain, and that also deeply informed my work. I was a prison chaplain when Trayvon Martin died, and
Mm,
so like all of these emerging conversations about patterns that have been going on for centuries, but really were being approached from a different angle, started coming out as I was ministering with people who were really living through the blunt after effects of a racist society and a racist policing system. So like being a prison chaplain really opened me to that as well.
I can only imagine. Um, but tell us about New City Church, because it sounds like it's a relatively novel and exciting church. How did that happen?
I think it's a rather exciting church, so I'm glad to hear that as well. Yeah, so I mean, New City Church, the racial demographics of New City Church match the racial demographics of the city of Minneapolis almost to the percentage point in terms of African American, white, Latinx, and Asian populations. We do have one member who's Native, but that's not reflective of the general population. But yeah, so we're doing multiracial community. New City is mostly millennial, Gen Z. Um, Probably 40% of New City Church identifies as LGBTQ plus, even though with COVID, it seems like that number is rising more and more. Like more and more people are coming out of the closet once they're stuck at home. And probably 40% of New City Church doesn't actively identify as Christian. So it's in many ways doing ministry on the ground of among a community of what America is going to look like pretty soon. So a lot of the stories that I learned doing community building and fostering a faith in Jesus there, I feel like has been increasingly applicable to more and more urban ministry settings.
And before we got started, you were telling me that you're within walking distance of George Floyd Square.
Yeah, yeah. So the racist murder of George Floyd happened within 4 minutes away from New City Church.
Wow.
And then the uprisings that sparked, obviously, the international uprisings happened mostly on Lake Street, which is a block away from where we meet. So, yep, it was an intense summer for sure. And I think it just, like a lot of the motivation for why I wrote Staying Awake has so much to do with what I saw happening in real time during the uprisings, that living a faithful life, living a spiritually grounded life, engaging in practices in community isn't just about spiritual decoration. It's about like discovering the deep resources that we need to tap into to be able to change the world.
So let's talk about the book. How did it come about?
um, so I was pastoring at New City, this multiracial, queer, Gen Z, millennial church, and a lot of folks were coming out to me saying like, okay, so I thought that I had completely closed the door on Christianity, and now I'm at New City Church and I'm seeing this community, and I'm kind of like willing to a little bit open the door to Christianity. Tell me who I should be reading, and
Hmm.
don't you dare recommend like a straight white guy, because those books are great, but like there's just too many of them. And so I was like, okay, yeah, let me go to my bookshelf and look. And I found amazing seminary textbooks. I found amazing memoirs. I found amazing kind of like biographies, but all of those assumed a certain level of familiarity with Christianity. Like it assumed that people knew why we worship or why we pray or why we gather as church. And for folks in my community, that cannot be an assumption that we make. Like, so I wrote Staying Awake, the Gospel for Changemakers, to be able to walk through some basic practices of Christianity and really explain it, not assuming any like pre-existing knowledge about what Christianity is about.
That sounds very useful for the population that you're dealing with, right? And for many others.
Right.
So, what about the process of writing it? I mean, did you just decide, okay, one day you said, okay, I got to turn all this into a book, and then you got an agent, or what was the actual process of creating the book? How did that look like?
Yeah, so I'm very grateful to have been able to partner with the Forum for Theological Exploration and Chalice Press to be able to, they really held my hand in getting some of the initial groundwork laid out. And, I initially was thinking about writing a book that was just geared towards pastors and church planters. But the more I reflected in community and the more I really listened to the Spirit, like I saw a gap of that needed to be filled with something that would be accessible to lay people, to people just starting out on Christianity. Not that there aren't other amazing books in that field, but there's just not enough. Like we just need more people talking about this. So that was really big for me. And then the title of the book came from one day I was in prayer, contemplating the Garden of Gethsemane and really like leaning into this image of Jesus with his disciples in this garden, about to face the most terrifying moment of his life. And as I continued to contemplate that, what really stuck out to me was this urgency from Jesus to his disciples to please stay awake, please stay awake. And what I heard back in prayer from God was like, Jesus never stopped asking disciples to stay awake.
Hmm.
Jesus never stopped asking us to be aware of the crucifixions and resurrections happening in our world. And like the act of discipleship is to lean into the reality of God in the world for truly the tragedies that entails, as well as the deep hope.
Hmm. Very cool. That's really great. So the book is actually coming out on April 6th, I believe. Is that
That's
correct?
right.
So
Yep.
right after Easter,
That's right.
still in the midst of a pandemic. You know,
Indeed.
what does your book launch look like?
Ooh, so it hits the shelf. The publishing date is April 6th. Our launch is on April 8th. I hope that you all watching this can make our launch party on April 8th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. So New City Church, like I said, really arose from the community. And one of the ways that I folded in community voices is to ask poets in the community to write poetry that I start each of our chapters with,
Hmm.
and then conclude with testimonies from the community on how that particular Christian practice has changed their lives. So how worship has changed their lives, how prayer has changed their lives. So the book launch is going to have music. There's going to be like some really fun elements, as well as community voices reading their poetry and their testimonies, coupled with kind of like my pastoral perspective on why we're doing what we're doing. So it's going to be a really good time. And there's already like, I lost count, but like many hundreds of people who are going to be tuning in online. So definitely please come in. And there will be some special giveaways that I'll be announcing on April 8th. So
Cool.
definitely, definitely worth tuning in for.
So I know that it's a little bit early to think about a future book, but I mean, have you thought at all about a future book?
I'm melting. No, I mean, of course, like as you know, whenever you start a book, you're automatically thinking of all the other books that could come
Sure,
out, because
sure.
I mean, truly so much of the process of writing is deciding what you're not going to write and really honing in and honoring the task in front of you. But I just think that there's really an emergence of the church that's happening in a way that is pretty unique to certainly the past 200 years, maybe the past 500 years of like what is happening and how we gather as Christians, how we relate to an increasingly global technologized community, and also how we combat the rising tide of white supremacy and violence that is stifling all of our country. So I do think that there's lots of opportunity there. But for right now, I'm mostly sticking to urging people to stay awake.
Yeah. No, you got to focus on that. I realize that. And, books take a while to come to be. So, I mean,
Sure.
no one's going to be expecting you to have another one next month or something like that.
But if there's any like angel investors who really just want to like dive in on that, Venmo me, Tyler Sit. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. But I love the way that you're thinking about this. I mean, we are in the midst of some very fundamental changes, shifts
Yeah.
in Christianity. And, as Phil Tickle would say, it happened every 500 years anyway, right? So,
Right.
and, the pandemic has certainly shifted the adaptation of technology like we're using today dramatically. So many more people now are comfortable with using it, and the technology is so much better than what it was just recently. That and all the social change that's going on, I think I totally agree with what you're saying. I mean, the form of church and the form of faith is not going to look like what it has.
And in some regards, like, thank goodness,
Yeah,
like there's
yeah.
some like bad habits that the church has developed that we really could do without moving forward, especially if Christianity is going to continue to be a force for social change in the world.
I mean, just one example, look at all the money we spend on physical capital,
Oh my gosh.
right? I mean, uh, and do we need that? I mean, is
It's a
that
lot.
really what, is the best way to follow Jesus, is to spend all of our money on building and grounds?
Right. And like, I'm a big fan of, working boilers, and I'm a big fan of ceilings, and, I'm a big fan of having a roof over my head. But at the end of the day, I think we need to reimagine how Christians can organize in increasingly adaptable settings. Like I think what the 21st century is showing us is that Christians need to be nimble more than anything, and our legacy doesn't really set us up for that necessarily. Even though I do want to say that certainly immigrant churches and churches of color are really on the forefront of maintaining nimbleness and figuring out how to like hustle to be able to make things work. Like that's something that's very familiar with expressions of Christianity that aren't within like kind of the white Christian domain.
Well, um, a lot of times there's a forcing function that's needed, right, in order to create change. And, sometimes those who are kind of fat, dumb, and happy aren't the best
I'm
position to
happy.
drive forcing functions. I mean, seriously. Necessity is the motherhood of invention. Is that the way that the quote goes?
Truly. Yeah. And I think that so many of the movement leaders of social justice movements in the story of America have mastered the art of forcing the change, or like not forcing, but um, confronting
Orchestrated.
the broader population with the reality of the situation and saying like, I'm not letting you look away from what is happening in our country collectively.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a lot to learn from that as far as how we can witness to the gospel.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Tyler, it's really great to meet you and hear about your book and your work with New City. I'm so excited about all of that.
Yeah, very grateful for all of you. On Instagram, I'm at Tyler Sit, and I'm on Facebook and tylersit.com. New City Church is in Minneapolis at Grow New City.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations on the book and best wishes going forward.
Yeah, God bless you. Thank you.